In this tutorial we'll go over the use of controllers on different objects and along with some examples how to use them. To add a controller to a certain object, I can right click on the left plane and press Add Controller. I can do this on every object or material of a certain object, and of course the parameters I can alter are the ones where the controller is attached to. So in this case, if I attach it to my chamfer cylinder, I have a few controllers available. An anchor controller. The anchor controller will create an anchor point, and with this anchor point I can anchor my object to that certain point. So if I double click my anchor point, I can see I have anchor point values, so X, Y, Z values where I can position my anchor point, and alignment settings where I can align it to left or right, and align it to top or bottom, or front or back. And as soon as I move my player head, my object will snap to that controller. So for instance, if I create a scaling animation, let's say I do it like this. You can see it will scale from the top left down to the right bottom. One of the other things to keep in account though is that you cannot change the position of your chamfer box in this, or chamfer cylinder in this case, anymore, because if I change my position over here, it will automatically snap back to my anchor position. So when I want to create a moving animation, I will have to animate my anchor point in this case. Okay, moving on to the next controller, the From-To controller. The From-To controller is basically a replacement to make animations aside from keyframes. So I can choose a certain property, let's say Precession X, and I can move it from 500 to 1200 with a certain start delay, with a certain duration in frames. So I could say, okay, well, it's 25 frames, so 1 second. I can have an interpolation just as with keyframes, and I have a wet dry. So in this case you will have an animation made with a From-To, and this allows you to, for instance, link to certain properties and even to certain properties of other objects by, for instance, using a link controller. The next controller is a link controller. The link controller can be used to link certain object properties to from one object to the other object. So I can use a different object. Let's say I want to use my clip, and I want to link my property X to the property X, or even another property of my current target object. And of course that is placed in the center, so it will snap to the center in this case. I can give it a certain scale, in this case 100%. I can give it 200 in order to make it twice as big. A certain offset, a minimum and maximum value, so it won't exceed that value. And of course the wet dry again. What this allows me as well is, for instance, what I can do is add a controller to a controller. So add a link controller to a link controller, for instance, and use a certain property over there. And of course the only properties that become available are the properties of my link controller. So using link controllers or any other controllers allows you to have a lot more control over your objects, and this is of course pretty limitless. So the last controller in the list is the Oscillate controller, and what the Oscillate controller allows me to do is move a certain property of an object in a certain shape, and this will just continue until you stop your controller or remove the object from screen. So there's no limit to the length of the animation. So in this case I could, for instance, set it to my Precession X, have it on a sine wave, set the value to 500, this value to 1200 for instance, move it in length to 50 frames, and this is my result. I can choose some other shapes as well. In this case I have a sine. I can use a sawtooth, which moves in a linear line from 500 to 1200 and then snaps back to 500. I can use a square which jumps from one value to the other. And I can use a triangle which has some sort of more jumpy gravity-like effect. So this could be good for creating gravity effect, for instance. One of the most common things to use this for is of course a 3D rotation. So a spinning box or a spinning cylinder in this case. To do that I can, for instance, choose my rotation X, and I will have to make a full rotation and then jump back and just keep on going. In order to do this I will have to set it to a sawtooth and make a rotation from 0 to 360. In this case it will move from 0 to 360 in a linear way and then suddenly jump back to 0, but of course 360 and 0 are the same value, so you don't see anything happening on screen. So in this case it will just keep on going. The only point is, if I start this now, nothing will happen. And as it states with the oscillator controller, I have to enable Euler interpolation for my rotation of the chamfer box, or in this case chamfer cylinder, in order to make this rotation possible. It is just a different sort of algorithm which is used for the rotation. So when I start this now, you can see I have a full rotating object which will just keep on going until I stop it. And this is basically the same thing the spin X, spin Y and spin Z apply to when you apply that oscillator controller to a certain object. So there's one controller missing currently from the list, the stack controller. The stack controller can only be used on groups. For this I've created 3 text boxes, which are the easiest way to show the usage of this controller. So I can group these together, and when I right click and press add controller I get a new controller available, the stack controller. And the stack controller allows me to stack certain objects together with a certain fixed space between them. So when I move my player head, in this case they will snap all together, and I can, for instance, give it a spacing of 10 pixels. And this allows me to, for instance, change one of the text fields. So I can change the height of this text field, for instance. And as you can see, all other objects will snap again to the stack and the offset I've set, so they will jump down automatically. So when I'm using dynamic text fields, for instance, I can easily stack certain objects together and make sure that they don't overlap.